and Governance, Jamia Millia Islamia. Formerly a fellow at a Centro in Country Humanius Cornell, Switzerland, currently he is associated with an international research project on critical post-media studies in Asia in collaboration with Tiko University, Japan, and Kinghee University, South Korea. Trained as an anthropologist, his primary research focuses on the anthropology of alcohol in Kerala and the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari. His edited book titled Deleuze, Guattari and India, Exploring a Post-Colonial Multiplicity with Ian Buchanan and George Burgess is published by Routledge in 2021. He is also editing another volume on Deleuze, Guattari and Schizoanalysis of Post-Media with Geoff Bradley and Alex Kwang Lee to be published by Bloomsbury and is expected to be out in 2022. So thank you, Manoj. Thank you, Eva. And over to Manoj, please.
Yeah, we are going to the second plenary session of the day and of the conference. And we have such an eminent speaker today for this plenary session, Professor Eva D. Bahovec. Let me just introduce her briefly. Eva D. Bahovec teaches contemporary philosophy at the Department of Philosophy, Faculty of Arts, University of Ljubljana, Slovenia. She has published essays in book collections, The New Plain Lacan Dialogues in 2015, A Companion to Beauvoir in 2017, and has just finished a book on Foucault's book titled Foucault's Royal Road Between Philosophy, History, and Psychoanalysis. She's the editor of Slovene's translation of Deleuze's book Nietzsche and Philosophy, as well as Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus. She was a founding editor of the Women's Studies Journal Delta and the honorary president of the City of Women Art Festival. It's a pleasure to share the session of Professor Eva D. Bahovec, and I'm seeing her after 1 year. Like I think last time was the World Congress in Delhi. So welcome you, Professor Eva D. Bahovec. It's up to you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to be able to take part of this really inspiring conference. And in this context, I'm going to talk about Deleuze and Guattari, of course, and about their long and beautiful friendship. Their long and beautiful philosophical friendship. Friendship with a happy ending, of course, like all the long and beautiful friendships, not only in real life end. I think Humphrey Bogart says to his comrade Lou, the head of the Moroccan police in the famous final scene at the Casablanca airport, I think this is a beginning of a long and beautiful friendship. As soon as Else, Ingrid Bergman at her best, took off on a plane to America with her Hungarian husband, who is the head of the resistance movement in the occupied Europe of the time. Friendship, beginning. Finally, Rick in the Casablanca movie, Bogart, got loose of his fatal love. He got rid of all these women, he and his comrade, and the woman question apart, but not solved. That leaves us with more space for male friendships, and in this charming atmosphere, then the beginning of a long and beautiful friendship is actually going to become a long battle, a continuation of French resistance movement, a rebellion against the Nazi regime all around Europe, and of course, in the first place, in the occupied France occupied by the Germans. Reed fled from France to Casablanca, where he's the owner, you all know, of the beautiful bar, beautiful casino, the center of Casablanca's nightlife. So, in a way, I would like to introduce this as our starting point as a dispositive. Might I use Foucault's word in this context? We have France, we have Germany, one side and the other, and their confrontation during the wartime Arab world, a world without women. What about now? And of course, what about philosophy? What about philosophical, long and beautiful French male friendships? A perfect word for a friendship, for a philosophical friendship, is of course the word of Deleuze and Guattari's. And in philosophical, I would say, geographical framework of modern philosophy as such. Between the Germans, as Nietzsche would say in his Gay Science, and the French, the Germans and the French, the opposition and an opposition, and a continuation. We, the Germans, we are all Hegelians, Nietzsche would go on and proceed with his endeavor, perhaps the most difficult one in philosophy, to have done with Hegel. Not just Kant, not just to have done with judgment and so on, but also Hegel with his Christian ideology. Hegel's dialectic, as you all know, being for the less Christian ideology all along. So we have to cope with the problem. We are confronted with the problem of reorienting philosophy in this framework, the Germans, the French, and to figure out the way how to get out of the German dispositive in philosophy more and more to the French, l'esprit de finesse, and all that goes along with it. Nietzsche was very careful to use French terms when introducing some of his most important turning points in philosophy. And in this context, I would like to address the idea of the beginning of the long and beautiful friendship once again. Actually, I'm going to talk about the beginning, not so much just for a beginning, about the beginning, but mostly about the end of their friendship, the end of the final scene, the final part, the final book, what is philosophy? The friendship, which I have no doubts was a beautiful one. So I'm going to talk about the final battle, the final outcome in the time of the French Third Republic, the beginning of the 19th. Deleuze and Guattari's friendships was a rather inspiring one, and it brought about a series, as you all know, of groundbreaking philosophical and psychoanalytic critique, all the way from perhaps the most notorious Anti-Oedipus in 1972, their thorough attempt to do away with, to confront and overcome Lacan and the Lacanians, passing through their book, of course, on Kafka, all the way down to Mille Plateaux in 1980, to finally reach the time and the space and language, and above all, aphilosophical orientation, a reorientation, enabling them, Deleuze and Guattari, a philosopher and a psychoanalyst, to do away with our philosophical heritage. Our heritage. Whose heritage? And why? So my question would be whether this final scene, final outcome would also include to have done with the Freudian left, or what was left of it, from Anti-Oedipus on until the very end in the What is Philosophy book, which was actually the Freudian left, which was actually so important for critical theory in Germany, in the Frankfurt School, and also in France, in the French philosophical moment, the one characterized by Badiou, Alain Badiou, in his exquisite formula, with and against Freud, which would mean, but not without Freud. And I would venture to say that this Germano-French spirit related to philosophy as critique, starting from Kant, renovated by Marx, of course, and continued in the Frankfurt School and then in the French philosophical moment. And I will let you know what else in the very near future should be related to the fact that this idea, the very idea of the possibility, the condition of critique, of philosophy as critique, is present in not today's European world, but I would really like to use this very special occasion to spread it into what I would really like to call Indo-European world. I really wonder, from the Mumbai conference, which Manuel already mentioned, from the Mumbai conference on, where I was first kindly invited, how come that, Deleuze and Guattari are so vividly present, so vividly present, not also in India, but most vividly, most lively related to life in India. I have seen it, I experienced it rather vividly during the Delhi conference, perhaps even more intensively. And I'm experiencing it now, here and now, and I in the first person. I know we have to work together on this issue, but I'm prepared to do it later on. First, let me say a word. Let me talk about philosophy and perhaps what should be done with philosophy. I will approach this problem and then go on to geophilosophy through another question. What is the arrogance of philosophy? What is the arrogance of philosophy? If we talk about our heritage, who are we? Whose heritage actually? Who speaks about whom actually? In the name of whom? Did Nietzsche speak in the name of we, the Germans, the Hegelians? Or did he, despite the fact of introducing the first person in philosophy, why am I so clever? Why do I write so good books and so on and so on? Is there, in a way, some kind of remnant of arrogance of philosophy in his teaching? Did Nietzsche nevertheless spoke in the name of the others, of the Germans or against the Germans, for the French, or for whom? And the main question would be, that also relates to me, to my site of enunciation. The main question would be, who can speak for whom instead of whom? Who can appropriate the voice of the other? And what is most important in philosophy, the voice of everybody. Philosophy is so arrogant in speaking in the name of all of us, instead of us, not letting us to speak. Arrogation of voice, of geo-philosophical dispositive as dispositive of knowledge and power, along with the dispositive of the exclusion of whom and why and when. And in the beautiful friendship of Gilles Deleuze with Michel Foucault, this exclusion would first, as you all know, be madness. This is very crucial for the whole long history of modern philosophy. And at this point, of course, to anticipate, I'm going to include the exclusion of women in a very similar way as madness has been excluded from history philosophy. and I'm going to, in a way, try to deconstruct a little bit history philosophy from this point of view. But the problem is, and this is what I got from Stanley Cavell and his excellent book, A Pitch of Philosophy, Autobiographical Exercises. The arrogance of philosophy, it's so telling, and it goes so much along with Deleuze and Guattari's thinking, I think. Philosophers seem to have adopted precisely the we of the universal side of enunciation, as it is in the case of Kant, as opposed to Nietzsche and so on. So we could go on here with Deleuze comparing, opposing Nietzsche's new image of thought to that of Kant's dogmatic image in this context of speaking, of the possibility of speaking, of appropriating a voice and not being silent anymore, not being something invisible, the silence of the man in Foucault, the silence in women, of women in the long history of philosophy. So I actually think that it was Deleuze and Guattari's friendship that allowed them not to be arrogant. However, there still seems to be a problem, which I'm going to address now. But first, let me once again describe this basic dispositive of how we actually envision philosophy. Always we have the Germans, the French, and of course we have to go back to antiquity. And of course, all these territories which are not to be reduced to national languages or national states or nationalism or whatever. But in this context, again, what is left of the left and what could be perhaps said about the very lost Freudian left today. In this context, using the notion of the arrogance of philosophy, I hope it is understandable enough that I want to talk from the side of enunciation of the first person and first person pronoun, and also trying to, in a way, appropriate this possibility of obtaining the very possibility of talking, of the site of enunciation. Not, if I'm talking about exclusions, I am actually not addressing the problem that I here sit in my, at home in Eastern Europe. So I'm not adding Eastern Europe to this German-Franco alliance, going back the Germans as well as the French to the golden age of the Greek antiquity. So my problem would be in this context, and my question would be how to in a way go back to Deleuze and Guattari from this whole dispositive, and how to think about opening up a question. I have to shorten a little bit, and now I'm going to point this out, I hope, clearly enough. When Deleuze talks about his writing instead of the animals who cannot write. Then we have this context of becoming animal, becoming woman, becoming molecular, becoming invisible. And it is in this context I would like to put this question of the voice, the arrogance of philosophy, the history of philosophy, and to proceed along the Deleuzian lines of speaking instead of the animals, which is not an arrogant gesture. instead of the animals who cannot talk. And then my first thought would be, why not instead of women as well? Should we pretend that women have their voice in philosophy? It would be an illusion of the a scandalous illusion, I would say. As Catherine Malabou has put it in one of her recent books, philosophy for women philosophy is a graveyard. And most certainly, I think we should agree with that. The problem with women is quite the opposite, not becoming an animal, becoming women, becoming invisible. But, the problem is how to empower women in philosophy, how to fight, as Malabou would say, this symbolic violence of philosophy, of all these major exclusions and arrogations and so on and so on. Precisely in an orientation of thinking which would help them to do away, them or us or me, to do away of being, the fact of being invisible. But there again, I'm trying to, in a way, describe this double bind of Deleuze and Guattari. I think we can find it there. And my double bind with Deleuze and Guattari, of course, since there again in their final move, in What is Philosophy, their final move is actually rather close to women's studies. Not just studies about women, about the concept of womanhood and so on, but for women. I think in Deleuze and Guattari, we always have this intention of speaking for somebody, not instead of, not an arrogant position, but for somebody as a major characteristic of their philosophical orientation, not in the name of women, arrogating their voice, but for them, not instead of women, but for women. I wonder, might it be the case that becoming woman would actually not mean to become minoritarian? Or is it the case that in spite of all Deleuze's interest in psychoanalysis, in Deleuze in his earlier works, and critique of psychoanalysis later on with Guattari, Deleuze never really appropriated the major Freudian, I would say, revolutionary invention or insight, namely that man is not one universal human subject, not one, that there are two, men and women, boys and girls in Freud's basic texts, but not in philosophy, not in a philosophical friendship. That is why I would like to, in a way, dissolve this philosophical friendship as described also in the latest book by Francois Doss, who wrote on history of structuralism and so on, amitié philosophique, philosophical friendships. And you have Deleuze and Guattari friendship there as a philosophical friendship, not in any way related to the very problematic issue of philosophy with and against Freud, as I mentioned it in relation to Badiou's formula, and also the friendship of Deleuze with Michel Foucault. I think that both of them actually, despite the fact that Foucault was a philosopher and Guattari was a psychoanalyst, were friendships which should be regarded from the point of view of this very important nexus in contemporary philosophy, in modern philosophy, evolving around with and against Freud. And my question, which I would really like to put forward with you together, what is left of the Freudian left? What did Deleuze and Guattari actually do with their anti-Oedipus book? Did they really, in a way, manage to do away with what was so bad with Lacanian, with the Lacanian school, the Lacanian orientation, the Lacanian institution, and so on. But on the other hand, then having to do away with this, the conceptual break, the major break, the Freudian revolution of, opening up a space for men and women, or a possible space for conceptualization of the difference or the many differences, as Freud already related the problem to bisexuality in every human being, and so on and so on. But nevertheless, where does this leave us nowadays? Actually, what is philosophy? And in this context, what is geophilosophy? I was first going to address the very idea of putting the question as the question, what is, in Deleuze, in his earlier works, and then later on. And I was, but there's no time for that now, perhaps later on in the discussion. I was also going to introduce the topic of what is in relation to the brilliant reading of Jacques Derrida, of Heidegger by Jacques Derrida, pointing out precisely that, this question of what is, and the way Derrida addresses everything actually in philosophy through the form of the question, what is metaphysics, what is thinking, what is truth, and so on, but never addresses the problem of what is the spirit, der Geist. It just uses the name and never defines it and never actually tries to analyze it. Never tries to analyze it. But then at a certain moment in his life, in Heidegger's life, actually this German Geist, German spirit, universal philosophical spirit, in a way, becomes the spirit of the German people, das Führende, what has to be, led, what needs a leader, a Führer, and so on. I think it's a very lovely and very inspiring and very actual problem of how to approach the possibility of thinking nowadays in this context of what is geophilosophy, what is German in this geophilosophy, how in the case of Derrida's reading of Heidegger, actually, how Heidegger could, what would be the possibility, the conditions of possibility for Heidegger who do this, I would say, not so nice step, to become director of German University in 1932. We always keep coming back to that. And of course, the problem is also addressed in the chapter on geophilosophy in example 8 at the very end of the chapter. But since now it is 11:30, let me first answer the question of my address, of my presentation. Is geophilosophy part of the solution or part of the problem? And let me proceed with a comparison, namely, already mentioned, Alain Badiou, one of the most influential French philosophers of our time. As you may be acquainted with his short essay, The Adventure of French Philosophy, which was published in the New Left Review, a presentation of French philosophy to the Anglo-Saxon world. And then it was published again in the book with the same title, The Adventure of French Philosophy, in 1913. What is the adventure? And what is French? A moment of philosophy. This is a crossing, a nexus, a paradox, Badiou says, that of the most universal being at the same time the most particular, a very Hegelian move in Badiou. the one we would most definitely like to get to do away with. But nevertheless, having a particular time and space as particular philosophy could be considered throughout three great moments, Badiou says. In fact, a very similar dispositive as in geophilosophy, but put in a much more schematic way. We have the moment of ancient Greece, the Enlightenment Germany, or German idealism, and the French philosophical movement, or moment, sorry, it should be movement, but it's a moment, or the adventure of French philosophy. And as Badiou points out, there are powerful cultural and natural particularities. And I think this cultural and natural particularities in Badiou should have been, I think, conceptually very precisely, in a way, elaborated through the geophilosophy concept. So from that point of view, actually, I think geophilosophy is part of the solution, or even the very solution to this old problem, or how to envision all these great traditions in philosophy. And yes, of course, then again, we have in Badiou, very importantly, the formula with and against Freud. And I wonder where that has been left out in contemporary philosophical debate. And then in a more recent interview on the German tradition in philosophy, Badiou with Nancy was discussing the problem of moments once again, and he introduced the topic of the three moments or discontinuities. He points out in this later interview, 5 years ago, this interview book was published in 1916, in 2016. And we're discussing the French moment, also introducing an English moment, but then just mentioning it and going on with this Franco-German alliance, and also explaining that the French moment, at first, at the very beginning, was the Franco-German moment, which step by step became more and more French and less German. It would be difficult to know what kind of cultural and national particularity this would involve. This is, of course, against Badiou. But anyway, there is some insight in what he's trying to say, and it should be put parallel to Deleuze's and Guattari's geophilosophy problem. And what he says, Badiou, in this later book, the end, now we are confronting the end of the French moment. And then he makes a certain remark saying that the French moment should actually be, in the book 5 years ago, the Franco-Slovene movement. Might we look at it more closely? Badiou says, let us not forget Slavoj Žižek and his descendants, and so on and so on. So that is really puzzling. It is really puzzling because we have only this, one introduction and one actually quotation that, of course, we have this big dispositive of the French and the Germans. And this is also a bit of a problem for me, the way the Germans, after the antiquity, geophilosophical context is described, the relation between philosophy on the one hand and the political situation, the democracy, the young democracy in Greece, the Greek polis, the life in cities and so on, and the states. And in philosophy as an internal condition, friendship, philosophical friendship as the counterpart to this external political geophilosophy moment. And that is why I would like to say, yes, again, I would like to say it again to conclude the first part. Yes, geophilosophy is the solution of the problem if we look at it from this Badiouian perspective, or even from, the very important need to get rid of this classical thinking about history, philosophy, and the need, really a desperate need to deterritorialize it. The way Deleuze and Guattari bring in history together with geophilosophy, geography, geology, astronomy, namely, as they say, historical relations of the earth that take shape and pass away from it, its geological relationship with eras and catastrophes, its astronomical relationship with the cosmos, all this deterritorialization. There is nothing of the kind in Badiou, and nothing of the kind can be found in Zizek's thinking. Although Zizek and Badiou work very much together, as you might be very well aware of. And in a way, I think that it is not a philosophical question. It is more a philosophical political alliance, I would say. But it is alliance also, and that is the problem I have in this constellation, in this dispositive. It is in a way, implicitly against Deleuze, Guattari, philosophical friendship, political friendship, and what goes along with it. And the second part of the problem, why there is still the problem, why geophilosophy is, apart from being part of a solution, the solution of the problem, also the problem of the problem. If I have some more, 5 minutes or so. Should I jump to the conclusion?
No, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So, the problem in geophilosophy actually is why philosophy in Greece is at that moment. Deleuze and Guattari say, just like Brodel, the famous historian, has put the question, why capitalism in these places at this moment? And this train of thought brings a new perspective. Badiou's formula with and against Freud becomes more real, more flesh and blood, more concrete. Or to put it in another way, why Freud? Why Freud in this particular moment in the Frankfurt School as well as in the French philosophical moment? How to get hold of this possibly new territories of explanation, considering the historical developments in the Frankfurt School. We all know, to put it in a very summarized manner, that the Frankfurt School during the first part of the 20th century, that would be the German critical theory, Adorno, Marcuse, Reich, from Benjamin and so on, they got hold of Freud precisely to give an explanation of fascism of that time, to explain how is it that the labor's movement in Germany at that time actually was not able to cope with fascism, that how actually that people, the proletarians, acted against their own interest, against their own material interest related to the place and the role in economic material production. So we cannot explain it through capitalism. It's a too massive category. Even with a monopoly capitalism, as fascism was supposed to be explained as an agency of monopoly capitalism. It's actually the very core of the problem, where Freud is desperately needed. It was historically desperately needed there in Germany, and it was historically desperately needed in Yugoslavia and ex-Yugoslavia. Slovenia is part of ex-Yugoslavia, and we talk about other parts of Yugoslavia as region, the regions. It was desperately needed in philosophy to confront what Marcuse has called Soviet Marxism. It was desperately, Freud was a desperately needed tool to politically opposed to Soviet Union, Yugoslavia was a non-allied country, and to fight Soviet Marxism. So it was, a very important tool, but I think it was even more than that, to fight Soviet propaganda, which I think should be put aside fascist propaganda, so brilliantly analyzed in Theodor Adorno in his, I think we should go back to that, in his essay on Freudian theory and the pattern of fascist propaganda. And this is the context, in which I think this mentioning Badiou of Slavoj Žižek, what Badiou calls the Franco-Slovenian movement. Badiou I think he's being polite, he's being nice to Žižek, he's being nice to our little, small, beautiful country on the sunny side of the Alps, and so on. But then again, the problem has not been coped with conceptually. And perhaps I should, the last thing in this context, which should be mentioned, that actually Žižek turned from the German critical philosophy orientation to French structuralism and Jacques Lacan, and this was not a difficult move. And this is what we have to take into account when talking about how to actually go beyond this classical idea of, philosophy being something in between Germany and France and vice versa, and so on. And beyond the question, which actually it is addressed, I think, very thoroughly, but perhaps did not go, the Lessing battery did not go far enough with it, whether this would be something which relates more to external circumstances, to historical contingencies, or internal condition of thinking. I remember well, in geophilosophy, in the last chapter of What is Philosophy, I left with this idea. On the one hand, we have these contingencies of the external and this necessity of condition and friendship as a condition of doing philosophy, creating concepts, philosopher as a friend of the concept. And then we have these different dispositives of friendships. Now, there is a lot to be said about not Slovenia, but Ljubljana, the Frankfurt School and the Ljubljana Latin School. But let me actually conclude with the second part of the question. Why is geophilosophy part of the problem? I think it's a brilliant idea. And all, the main topics, the earth, the friendship, the polis, the antique polis, and it works very well with the antiquity and Greek philosophical moment, but I think it somehow breaks and it has to be elaborated further on. The very moment we approach the German moment, let alone the French moment. And I have this problem, and that is why I think that geophilosophy is also part of the problem. I have this problem the way the answer is sought in capitalism. What the Greek cities and states were to Greek philosophy, they say, we can read that in the book, What is Philosophy? Capitalism was to modern philosophy. It was not an influencer, but rather kind of I would say, love and hate relationship. And there are so many issues and aspects which should be discussed in relation to this category of capitalism. And it does not really provide us with an answer to the very specific and particular aspect of geophilosophy in relation to the German world. So I think geophilosophy is really a solution of the problem when we discuss the way it has been explained in the antiquity, the relationship between the inner conditions of thinking and friendship in that connection, friendship against the rivals and rivalry, and the whole story and so on. But that we have to work very thoroughly on this German and then German-Franco and then perhaps Franco-Slovene part of it. And also the way which in a way to me seems quite close to Derrida's reading of Heidegger, but nevertheless, actually the Lucian-Guattari say that Heidegger and the problem of course, of the Nazi Germany, that it is still an open question then how Heidegger is related to the problem. This is a quotation from the Geophilosophy chapter from the book, What is Philosophy? Deterritorialization. I always wonder whether I might be able to pronounce this word as it should be. I have to practice a little bit. Deterritorialization of Heidegger's philosophy into the Nazi Germany. That is actually a quotation from the book. And I wonder where to go on from that, from that quotation. I most definitely would like to hear some more of it and something else perhaps. And then the very end of the chapter on geophilosophy, which is of course the fourth chapter of the text, What is Philosophy? What is then? The end is number 9. Number 8 is this discussion on Heidegger. And number 9 in geophilosophy, which should be a move away from history to becoming, and to the space, to geography, geology, astronomy, and so on. Then we are confronted with number 9, which is a puzzle to me, and where 3 notions are introduced. Atemporel, a problematization of the eternal through Peggy, and a friend of Deleuze's, and goes on from atemporel to untimely, as defined in Nietzsche, in opposition to the present time, and so on. And finally, we have the actual, the category of the actual, and nobody else than Michel Foucault. And here again, we are confronted with this issue I'd like to put forward today, how to bring in the discussion of the long and beautiful friendship of Deleuze and Guattari, also the much more puzzling, perhaps not so beautiful philosophical friendship of Deleuze with Guattari. Because the whole discussion actually ends with Michel Foucault, and curiously enough, Deleuze and Guattari in their discussion, on geophilosophy, actually go back to the question of what is enlightenment, and the way Foucault answered to the question of what is enlightenment, which is precisely the question that bears upon history and historicity and takes us away from geophilosophy and so on. And, the aim in the heart of the present, redoing the universal from the specific moment of time, not space, not place, not geologically, geographically, but moment of time we live in what Foucault calls critical ontology of the present, and so on. And actually, the last word in this discussion of Deleuze and Guattari of the last chapter on geophilosophy is a proper name, that of Michel Foucault. Freud, Zizek, Badiou, to do away with all that. Let me conclude. For the conclusion, go back to the Casablanca ending. Casablanca, the famous movie, perhaps one of the most famous one in the Hollywood capitalist production. Michael Curtis, as you may be aware of, the famous filmmaker, was not sure actually what the end of the movie should be. When he started shooting the movie, he didn't know how it is going to end. Whether it is, well, I'm not going to fantasize or dream about the possible endings, you know, beyond this Lacanian impossible choice, either the loved man or political engagement and resistance. And of course, precisely the resistance of the French against the German Nazi political totalitarianism and so on. And perhaps I should leave you with that, or leave that for the discussion. The open question, we do not know. It would be very nice that we wouldn't know what the Casablanca ending in the film would be. And with that, I would like to leave you with an open question, to open the question in so many different meanings of the word. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Siva, for the wonderful presentation. I think this was a continuation of the many discussions that we started off with the day, like, you know, Paul starting off with friendship and social conduct, though we didn't develop it further, but Sundar again problematizing what is to sort of envision the tradition in philosophy, and what does it mean to deterritorialize its history in the sense, in terms of its practice. So this is in a way, in fact, a continuation of the discussion that we were having the forenoon session. And so I'm really happy about it. But I'm really afraid that whether we will have enough time for a discussion, because your presentation was a bit long, but it's fine. I will wait for some pressing comments on this. We can take 1 or 2 questions, and then we will move on to the next session. So please raise your hand. You can directly, no, you don't have to raise hand. You can just unmute your mic and ask the question. That's it.
Can I just add one thing which I had to, in a way, I was not able to present it during my presentation. Actually, at the very end, I should have gone back to return to the woman question and the exclusion and everything that is related to that. But just to open at least a first possible starting point in the book. In the introduction to what is philosophy, we have this puzzling, very interesting note. I will just quote it. It will take a minute. What does a friend mean when it becomes a conceptual persona or a condition for exercise of thought? And this is the most important part of it, where the Lussengateri actually go beyond the friendship, the male friendship problem, the male friendship condition for doing philosophy. It goes on like this. Or even a lover. Is it not rather a lover? And with not the friend, will not the friend reintroduce within thought itself a vital relation to the other that one had believed excluded from pure thought? I wonder in this context whether the other, the female other, is conceptualized in psychoanalysis or anywhere else in feminism, in Lycurgus and so on, is actually the core of the problem. And that is where we should go on with rereading, with our rereading of geophilosophy. Sorry for that. I had to introduce the lover. Not just friends.
Yes, of course. I think we don't have any questions, but it was a wonderful presentation. It's like starting off with problematizing or deconstructing the notion of philosophical friendship, bringing it in the context of the Freudian left anti-Oedipus and the role of anti-Oedipus, and what is to deterritorialize its history in terms of geophilosophy, whether it's a part of the problem or the part of the solution. So those points were critically examined, and And as you raised in the middle of the presentations, the question of women and philosophy, and ended with that note, I think these are pressing questions in terms of any form of deconstruction of philosophical history. So these were also part of our earlier discussions, and these discussions will go on, and we will have more discussions further. Thank you, Eva, for joining us. And we will be having you more in our future conferences as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.